In the autumn of 1878, the small town of Harrodsburg, Kentucky, became the stage for one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. What began as a series of unexplained disappearances during the annual Harvest Festival would unveil a truth so macabre that even seasoned investigators would struggle to comprehend the depths of human depravity. This is the story of Thomas Ellery, a man whose charming smile concealed appetites that defied all understanding, and whose victims would number far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The crisp October air carried the scent of burning leaves and apple cider through the dirt roads of Harrodsburg that fall. The town, nestled in the rolling hills of central Kentucky, had always been a quiet place where neighbors knew each other's names, and children played freely in the streets until dusk painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson. But something had changed that season. Something imperceptible at first, like a shadow growing longer as the sun sets, until darkness consumes everything in its path. It started with Margaret Hutchinson, a 23-year-old seamstress who lived above her small shop on Main Street. She was last seen on October 12th, leaving the general store with fabric for a wedding dress she was commissioned to make. Her landlord found her room untouched 3 days later, the fabric still wrapped in brown paper on her work table, her bed neatly made, as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The sheriff, a weathered man named Clayton Pierce, initially dismissed it as a young woman running off with a suitor, despite protests from Margaret's family that she would never abandon her responsibilities. 2 weeks later, James Whitmore disappeared. The 40-year-old blacksmith was known for his reliability and his evening routine of closing his forge at precisely 6 o'clock. When he failed to show up for Sunday service, and his forge remained cold and locked for 3 consecutive days, concern rippled through the community. Sheriff Pierce could no longer dismiss the pattern. Something was hunting in Harrodsburg. Then came the festival. Every year, Harrodsburg hosted a 3-day harvest celebration that drew visitors from neighboring counties. Merchants set up colorful stalls selling everything, from hand-carved toys to preserved fruits. Musicians played fiddles and banjos on makeshift stages. Children ran through the crowds with sticky fingers from candy apples and honeycomb. And in the center of the town square, surrounded by torches that flickered against the October darkness, stood a striped tent that promised wonders and entertainment. That tent belonged to Thomas Ellery. He had arrived in Harrodsburg 5 days before the festival, driving a weathered wagon pulled by 2 gray horses. Ellery was a traveling performer, he claimed, a purveyor of joy and laughter in an increasingly serious world. He was a tall man, perhaps 6 feet in height, with broad shoulders and hands that seemed too large for the delicate juggling acts he performed. His face was painted white, with exaggerated red circles on his cheeks, and a wide crimson smile that stretched from ear to ear. His eyes, however, remained unpainted, 2 dark pools that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The townspeople were initially charmed by Ellery's arrival. He performed free shows for children in the afternoons, making coins disappear and reappear behind their ears, twisting colorful balloons into animal shapes, telling jokes that made even the most serious adults crack smiles. He had a voice that carried across the square, warm and inviting, with just a hint of mystery that made people lean in closer to hear his words. Parents felt safe sending their children to watch his performances. After all, what harm could come from a clown? Ellery set up his tent on the eastern edge of the square, near the old Presbyterian church. The tent itself was modest, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with red and white stripes that had faded from years of sun and rain. A wooden sign hung at the entrance, painted in elaborate letters that read, "Ellery's Cabinet of Curiosities, Wonders Beyond Imagination, Adults Only After Dark." During the day, the tent remained closed, a silent presence among the festival chaos. But when the sun set and families retreated to their homes, the tent came alive. Ellery's nighttime shows were invitation-only affairs. He would walk through the festival crowds during the afternoon, observing people, engaging them in conversation, and occasionally extending a small card to select individuals. The card was black with silver lettering that simply stated a time, 10 o'clock, come alone. Those who received the cards felt chosen, special, as if they had been granted access to something extraordinary. And they always came. The first night of the festival, October 26th, 12 people received cards. By midnight, only 11 had returned home. Samuel Brennan, a 29-year-old clerk at the county courthouse, never made it back to the boarding house where he rented a room. His landlady reported him missing the following morning, showing Sheriff Pierce the neatly made bed that suggested Samuel had never returned. The sheriff added Samuel's name to a growing list that now contained 4 names, though he had no evidence, no witnesses, no bodies, and no real understanding of what was happening in his town. Sheriff Clayton Pierce was not a man easily disturbed. He had served in the war between the states, had seen battlefields where the ground was soaked red with blood, had held dying men in his arms as they called out for mothers who would never hear them. He thought he had witnessed the worst of what humanity could offer. But the pattern emerging in Harrodsburg troubled him in ways that combat never had. War had rules even in its chaos. This was something else entirely. Pierce stood in his small office on the morning of October 27th, studying a hand-drawn map of Harrodsburg spread across his desk. Red marks indicated the last known locations of the missing individuals. Margaret Hutchinson's mark was near the general store. James Whitmore's was at his forge. Samuel Brennan's was at the festival square. He added more marks for 2 other disappearances he had not yet made public, not wanting to cause panic. All the marks formed a rough circle around the town center, with one common point of convergence, the area where Thomas Ellery had set up his tent. Pierce had attended one of Ellery's daytime performances, watching from the back of a small crowd as the clown juggled flaming torches while balancing on a wooden ball. The performance was impressive, undeniably skillful, but something about Ellery's movements seemed wrong to Pierce. The clown moved with a precision that was almost mechanical, each gesture calculated, each smile timed perfectly. And those eyes, constantly scanning the crowd, seemed to be measuring rather than entertaining, as if Ellery was selecting cuts of meat at a butcher shop. The sheriff decided to investigate Ellery's background. He sent telegrams to neighboring counties, asking if anyone knew of a traveling performer named Thomas Ellery. The responses that trickled back over the next 2 days painted a disturbing picture. 3 counties reported similar disappearances coinciding with Ellery's visits. In Jessamine County, 2 people had vanished during a summer fair where Ellery had performed. In Boyle County, a farmhand disappeared after attending one of Ellery's nighttime shows. In Garrard County, a widow who lived alone was last seen entering Ellery's tent. None of these cases had been connected because Ellery moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to establish a clear pattern. But Pierce saw the pattern now, and it made his blood run cold. He estimated that Ellery had been traveling through central Kentucky for at least 2 years, possibly longer. If the pattern held across other regions, the number of victims could be staggering. Pierce realized he was not dealing with ordinary criminal activity. This was something systematic, something planned with chilling deliberation. On the evening of October 27th, Pierce positioned himself across the square from Ellery's tent, hidden in the shadows of the courthouse steps. He watched as the festival crowds thinned, families heading home as darkness settled over Harrodsburg. The temperature had dropped significantly, and Pierce's breath formed small clouds in the cold air. He pulled his coat tighter and waited. At 9:45, figures began approaching the tent. Pierce counted them carefully. 7 people, all adults, all carrying the black invitation cards. He recognized most of them. Martha Jenkins, who ran the bakery on 3rd Street. Robert Caldwell, a tobacco farmer from just outside town. Sarah Delaney, a schoolteacher known for her curiosity about unusual things. Others whose faces were familiar, but whose names escaped him in the darkness. They entered the tent one by one, disappearing through the flap that Ellery held open, his painted smile gleaming in the torchlight. Pierce waited 15 minutes after the last person entered, then moved closer, circling around to the back of the tent. He pressed his ear against the canvas, straining to hear what was happening inside. At first, there was only silence. Then he heard Ellery's voice, smooth and hypnotic, though Pierce could not make out the specific words. The voice went on for several minutes, rising and falling in what sounded almost like a chant or incantation. Then came other sounds, A gasp, a strangled cry quickly muffled, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. Pierce's hand moved to the revolver at his hip. He was preparing to burst into the tent when he heard footsteps behind him. He spun around to find Thomas Ellery standing there, no longer in his clown costume but wearing simple dark clothes. The white paint was gone, revealing a surprisingly ordinary face, though those dark eyes remained as unsettling as ever. In the moonlight, Pierce could see that Ellery was smiling, but it was not the exaggerated painted smile of his performances. This smile was small, almost gentle, which somehow made it far more terrifying. "Good evening, Sheriff Pierce," Ellery said quietly, his voice lacking the theatrical quality it had during performances. "I have been expecting you. I saw you watching this afternoon, saw the way you looked at me. You are a perceptive man, which is unfortunate for both of us. Would you like to see what is inside my tent? Would you like to understand what you have been investigating?" Pierce drew his revolver, aiming it at Ellery's chest. His hand was steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. "You are under arrest for the murders of Margaret Hutchinson, James Whitmore, Samuel Brennan, and others. Put your hands where I can see them." Ellery did not move. He simply continued smiling that terrible, gentle smile. "Murder, Sheriff? Is that what you think this is? How limited your understanding of the world must be. But please, arrest me if you wish. Take me to your jail. Lock me in a cell. It will not change anything. It will not bring back those who have already been transformed, and it will not save those who are waiting inside my tent right now, wondering why the show has not yet begun." Sheriff Pierce kept his revolver trained on Ellery, his mind racing through options. He could shoot the man right here, claim self-defense, and deal with the consequences later. But something about Ellery's calm demeanor suggested that violence would not solve this situation. The man showed no fear of the weapon aimed at his heart, no concern about being arrested. It was as if he existed outside the normal rules that governed human behavior. "What do you mean by transformed?" Pierce demanded, his voice steady despite the unease churning in his gut. "What have you done to those people?" Ellery tilted his head slightly, studying Pierce with an expression that might have been curiosity or amusement. "I have given them purpose, Sheriff. I have taken their mundane existence and elevated it into something meaningful. They are no longer simply living their small lives in this small town. They have become part of something greater, something that will outlive us all. Would you like to understand? I can show you if you have the courage to look." Pierce's finger tightened on the trigger, but he did not fire. Years of training and instinct told him that killing Ellery might doom whoever was inside that tent. He needed to understand what he was dealing with before taking irreversible action. "Show me," he said, gesturing with the revolver toward the tent entrance. "But know that if you make any sudden movements, I will put a bullet through your skull." Ellery's smile widened slightly. "Of course, Sheriff. I would expect nothing less from a man of your experience. Please follow me, and prepare yourself. What you are about to witness will challenge everything you believe about the nature of existence." They walked to the front of the tent, Pierce maintaining a careful distance behind Ellery, his weapon never wavering. The festival square was now completely deserted, the other merchants having packed up their wares and departed hours ago. The only sounds were the wind rustling through fallen leaves and the distant barking of a dog somewhere in the darkness. Ellery pulled aside the tent flap and gestured for Pierce to enter. The interior of the tent was dimly lit by oil lamps hanging from the support poles. The space was larger than it appeared from outside, perhaps an optical illusion created by the arrangement of furniture and curtains. The floor was covered with sawdust that muffled their footsteps. In the center of the tent stood a large wooden cabinet, perhaps 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide, decorated with elaborate carvings of figures that seemed to writhe and dance in the flickering lamplight. But it was not the cabinet that seized Pierce's attention. It was the people. The 7 individuals who had entered the tent earlier sat on benches arranged in a semicircle facing the cabinet. They were completely motionless, their eyes open but unfocused, their mouths slightly agape. They appeared to be breathing, their chests rising and falling slowly. But they showed no awareness of Pierce and Ellery's entrance. It was as if they were suspended in some state between waking and sleeping, present but absent. Pierce moved closer, keeping his weapon aimed at Ellery while examining the seated figures. He waved his hand in front of Martha Jenkins' face. No response. He called out Robert Caldwell's name. No reaction. Their skin was pale, almost translucent in the lamplight, and Pierce could see the blue tracery of veins beneath the surface. He checked Martha's pulse at her wrist and found it slow, perhaps 30 beats per minute, far below what should be normal for a conscious adult. "What did you do to them?" Pierce asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "What kind of poison did you use?" "Poison," Ellery laughed softly, moving to stand beside the wooden cabinet. "Nothing so crude, Sheriff. These people volunteered to be here. They came seeking wonder, seeking something to break the monotony of their ordinary lives. And I am giving them exactly what they desired. They are experiencing things beyond your comprehension, traveling to places that exist outside the narrow confines of this world. Their bodies remain here, but their consciousness, their essential selves, are elsewhere." Pierce did not believe in mysticism or spiritualism. He was a practical man who dealt in evidence and observable facts. But he could not deny what he was seeing. These people were clearly in some altered state. Found the pattern of disappearances suggested that some individuals who entered this tent never emerged. "Where are the others?" he demanded. "Margaret Hutchinson, James Whitmore, Samuel Brennan. Where are their bodies?" Ellery's hand moved to the cabinet, his fingers tracing the carved figures with what appeared to be genuine affection. "Bodies, Sheriff? You still do not understand. There are no bodies. Those individuals completed their transformation. They moved beyond the need for physical form. They became pure essence, pure experience. And their essence remains here, in this cabinet, sustaining it, empowering it to facilitate the transformation of others." Pierce's mind reeled at the implications. Was Ellery insane, lost in some delusional fantasy? Or was there some grain of truth hidden in his ravings? Pierce had heard stories during the war of men driven mad by what they had witnessed, creating elaborate mythologies to explain the inexplicable horror around them. But Ellery showed no signs of madness. He spoke with calm certainty, like a teacher explaining basic arithmetic to a slow student. "I am going to open this cabinet now," Ellery continued, his hand moving to an ornate brass latch, "and you will see the truth, Sheriff Pierce. You will understand what I have been doing and why it cannot be stopped. The process has been in motion for far longer than my lifetime. I am merely the current custodian, the current facilitator. When I am gone, another will take my place. The cabinet must be fed. It must continue its work." Pierce aimed his revolver at Ellery's hand. "Do not open that cabinet. Step away from it and put your hands behind your head. This ends now." But Ellery's fingers were already turning the latch. Pierce's finger tightened on the trigger. Time seemed to slow as the cabinet doors began to swing open, revealing darkness within, a darkness that seemed somehow more absolute than the mere absence of light. And from that darkness came a sound, a whisper, that seemed to bypass Pierce's ears and speak directly into his mind, promising knowledge, promising transformation, promising release from all the burdens of mortal existence. Pierce fired. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating every corner of the tent. The bullet struck Ellery in the shoulder, spinning him away from the cabinet. But Ellery was laughing, blood spreading across his shirt, his eyes blazing with something that might have been triumph or madness or both. "Too late, Sheriff," he gasped. "The door is open, and they are so very hungry." The darkness that spilled from the cabinet was not simply the absence of light. It had substance, texture, almost as if the shadows themselves had become liquid and were flowing across the sawdust-covered floor. Pierce watched in horror as the darkness reached the 7 seated figures, wrapping around their legs like living serpents. The people remained motionless, still trapped in their trance-like state, unaware of what was happening to them. Pierce fired twice more at the cabinet, hoping to somehow close it or destroy it. The bullets tore through the wooden panels, creating splintered holes, but the darkness continued to pour out unabated. Ellery had collapsed against the tent wall, clutching his wounded shoulder, but he was still laughing, a wet, gurgling sound that suggested the bullet might have punctured his lung. "You cannot kill it with bullets, Sheriff," he managed between gasps. "You cannot kill hunger itself." Pierce holstered his revolver and grabbed Martha Jenkins, trying to pull her away from the encroaching darkness. But she was impossibly heavy, as if she had been anchored to the bench. He pulled harder, muscles straining, and she finally tumbled forward into his arms. Her eyes remained vacant, her body limp as a doll. Pierce dragged her toward the tent entrance, his boots sliding on the sawdust as he fought for purchase. Behind him, the darkness reached Robert Caldwell. Pierce watched over his shoulder as the shadows climbed up Caldwell's body, covering him like a second skin. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Caldwell's body began to change. His skin grew even paler, taking on a waxy, translucent quality. His mouth opened wider than should have been anatomically possible, jaw dislocating with a sound like cracking ice. And from that impossible mouth came a scream, not of pain but of something else. Something that suggested Caldwell was experiencing sensations for which human language had no adequate description. Pierce reached the tent entrance and shoved Martha Jenkins through the flap, out into the cold October night. He turned back, knowing he should run, knowing he should save himself and raise the alarm, but unable to abandon the remaining 6 people to whatever horror was unfolding. He drew his revolver again and fired at the cabinet repeatedly, emptying the cylinder. Each bullet hit home, reducing sections of the cabinet to splinters, but the darkness continued to flow. Sarah Delaney was next. The schoolteacher, known for her love of poetry and her gentle nature, began to convulse as the darkness covered her. Her body jerked violently, limbs moving in ways that defied joint limitations. Her eyes rolled back, showing only whites, and her mouth stretched into that same impossible grin. But unlike Caldwell, whose scream had been audible, Sarah made no sound. Her throat worked, muscles straining, but only silence emerged, as if her voice had been stolen before the scream could form. Pierce reloaded his revolver with trembling hands, his training taking over, even as his mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. He aimed at Ellery, who had slumped further down the tent wall, leaving a dark smear of blood on the canvas. "How do I stop it?" Pierce shouted. "Tell me how to close that door." Ellery's laugh had devolved into a wet cough, blood flecking his lips. "You cannot close it, Sheriff. The door opens both ways. It allows the hunger to enter our world, and it allows consciousness to leave. Those who are taken feed the hunger, and in return, they experience what lies beyond. It is a transaction, you see, an exchange, and the hunger is never satisfied. It has been growing for centuries, consuming thousands, and it will continue long after we are both dust." The remaining 4 people on the benches began to change simultaneously, their bodies contorted, bones cracking and reforming beneath the skin. Their clothes tore as their frames expanded and contracted in rapid succession, as if they were being pulled in multiple directions at once. Pierce watched in sick fascination as their faces elongated, features smearing like wet paint, losing all resemblance to human physiognomy. Then Pierce understood. These were not murders in any conventional sense. Ellery was not killing these people. He was transforming them, feeding them to some entity that existed within or beyond that cabinet, something that consumed their physical forms and replaced them with something else. The disappearances made sense now. There were no bodies because the victims were being completely absorbed, every trace of their existence erased except for whatever remained trapped in that darkness. Pierce made a decision. He could not save the people in the tent. They were already lost, already in the process of transformation, but he could prevent this from happening again. He could destroy the tent, burn it to the ground with the cabinet inside. He grabbed one of the oil lamps hanging from a support pole and smashed it against the ground. Flames immediately caught on the sawdust, spreading rapidly across the floor. Ellery's eyes widened, the first sign of genuine emotion Pierce had seen from him. "No, you fool, if you destroy the cabinet here, the door remains open. It will find another vessel, another form. You cannot contain the hunger by burning it. You can only redirect it." But Pierce was no longer listening. He smashed the remaining lamps, creating multiple points of ignition. The dry canvas of the tent caught fire quickly, flames racing up the walls and across the ceiling. The heat became intense within seconds, and Pierce backed toward the entrance, his skin feeling tight and scorched. The transformed figures, whatever they had become, showed no reaction to the fire. They remained seated even as flames licked at their clothing, even as their altered flesh began to blacken and char. They made no attempt to escape, as if the fire was simply another sensation to be experienced, neither painful nor pleasant, merely existing. Pierce stumbled out of the tent and found Martha Jenkins stirring on the ground where he had left her. Her eyes were focusing now, awareness returning to her face. She looked up at Pierce with confusion and fear. "Sheriff? What happened? Where am I?" Pierce did not answer. He was watching the tent burn, the flames now visible from across the square, shooting 30 feet into the night sky. He could hear the screams starting from distant houses as townspeople woke to the sight of the fire. Soon there would be people running with buckets, trying to contain the blaze. But Pierce knew it was already too late for containment. The tent would burn completely, and hopefully the cabinet with it. Inside the inferno, barely visible through the flames, Pierce saw a figure standing. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long and too numerous. It might have been one of the transformed victims, or it might have been something that had come through the cabinet, something that had been waiting on the other side of that darkness. The figure raised what might have been a hand, and Pierce felt a cold sensation wash over him despite the heat from the fire. It was as if the figure was marking him, claiming him, promising that their encounter was not finished. Then the tent collapsed inward, the support poles giving way, and the figure disappeared beneath the burning canvas. Pierce closed his eyes and prayed, though he was not a religious man, that the fire would consume everything, that the door Ellery had spoken of would be closed forever. But in his heart, remembering Ellery's final words, Pierce feared that he had only solved a temporary problem. Somewhere else, in another town, another tent would appear. Another custodian would facilitate the feeding. The hunger was never satisfied, Ellery had said. And as Pierce watched the flames consume what remained of Thomas Ellery's cabinet of curiosities, he realized with growing dread that the story was far from over. The dawn broke over Harrodsburg with an unusual silence. The festival square, which should have been bustling with merchants preparing for the final day of celebration, stood empty except for the blackened circle where Thomas Ellery's tent had burned. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, mixing with the morning fog that rolled in from the surrounding hills. Sheriff Pierce had not slept. He sat on the courthouse steps, his coat wrapped tight against the cold, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Martha Jenkins had been taken to Dr. Samuel Morrison's house, where she was being examined and cared for. She remembered nothing of entering the tent or what happened inside. Her last clear memory was receiving the black invitation card and feeling an overwhelming curiosity about what wonders Ellery might show. Everything after that was blank, a void in her consciousness that troubled her deeply. Dr. Morrison found her physically healthy, if somewhat dehydrated and confused, but he could offer no explanation for her lost time. The 6 others who had been inside the tent were gone. Pierce had organized a search of the ashes once they cooled enough to approach, but they found no human remains, no bones, no teeth, nothing that would indicate 6 people had burned to death. They found the twisted metal remains of the oil lamps, some brass fittings that might have been from the cabinet, and strange markings in the ash that formed patterns Pierce could not interpret. But no bodies. It was as if the 6 people had simply ceased to exist. Thomas Ellery's body was also absent from the ruins. Pierce had shot him, had seen the blood spreading across his shirt, had watched him collapse against the tent wall. The man should have died in the fire if the gunshot wound had not killed him first. But there was nothing in the ashes, no remains of any kind. Pierce tried to convince himself that perhaps Ellery had escaped during the chaos, had crawled out while Pierce was distracted by the transformations happening around him. But he knew that was unlikely. Ellery had been too badly wounded to move. As the sun climbed higher, townspeople began to emerge from their homes, drawn to the festival square by rumors that had spread through the night. They stood in small clusters, speaking in hushed voices, pointing at the burned circle, sharing theories about what had happened. Some claimed it was an accident, a lamp knocked over during a performance. Others whispered darker suspicions, connecting the fire to the disappearances that had plagued Harrodsburg over the past weeks. Pierce addressed the gathered crowd from the courthouse steps, choosing his words carefully. He explained that there had been a fire at the traveling performers' tent, that several people were unaccounted for, and that the investigation was ongoing. He did not mention the cabinet, the darkness, the transformations he had witnessed. Who would believe him? He barely believed it himself in the harsh light of day. Perhaps it had been smoke inhalation, hallucinations brought on by the fumes from burning canvas and wood. Perhaps his mind had invented horrors to explain what was simply a tragic accident, but he knew that was not true. The memories were too vivid, too detailed. He could still hear the sound of Robert Caldwell's jaw dislocating, could still see Sarah Delaney's silent scream, could still feel the cold sensation when that impossibly tall figure had raised its hand toward him. These were not hallucinations. They were real and they had happened, and Pierce would carry the weight of that knowledge for the rest of his life. By midday, the festival was officially cancelled. Merchants packed their wagons and departed, eager to leave Harrodsburg and its troubles behind. The mood in town shifted from concern to fear as families realized that their neighbors, friends, and relatives who had attended Ellery's show were simply gone. No bodies to bury, no closure, no answers. Just absence where there should have been presence. Pierce spent the afternoon sending telegrams to every county sheriff in central Kentucky, warning them about Thomas Ellery and his tent. He described the pattern of disappearances, the invitation cards, the nighttime performances. He urged them to arrest Ellery on sight if he appeared in their jurisdictions, but even as he composed the messages, Pierce suspected they would do no good. Ellery had warned him that the hunger could not be stopped, that destroying the cabinet would only force it to find another form. If Ellery was right, if this was truly something that had existed for centuries, then one sheriff's telegrams would not protect anyone. As evening approached and the square emptied once more, Pierce returned to the burned circle. He knelt in the ash, running his fingers through the still warm residue, searching for something he could not name. Some piece of evidence that would make sense of what he had witnessed, some proof that would allow him to warn others effectively. But there was nothing, just ash and the fading smell of smoke, and the certain knowledge that Thomas Ellery's legacy would continue, one way or another, somewhere else. 3 days after the fire, Pierce received a telegram from Sheriff Marcus Webb in Danville, a town 40 miles southeast of Harrodsburg. The message was brief but chilling. Traveling performer arrived yesterday. Matches your description. Setting up tent for weekend show. What are charges? Pierce immediately saddled his horse and rode through the night. Arriving in Danville as dawn broke over the rolling tobacco fields that surrounded the town, Sheriff Webb was a younger man than Pierce, perhaps 35, with the confident bearing of someone who had never encountered anything his gun and badge could not handle. He met Pierce at the town's small jail, offering coffee and a skeptical expression as Pierce explained why he had ridden through the night. "So you are telling me this performer is responsible for disappearances across multiple counties, but you have no bodies, no witnesses, and no physical evidence?" Webb asked, his tone making clear what he thought of Pierce's investigation. Pierce could not blame the man for his skepticism. Told in the harsh light of day, his story sounded absurd. A magic cabinet that transformed people, darkness that had substance, figures that defied human anatomy. If someone had told Pierce such a tale a week ago, he would have dismissed it as the ravings of someone who had spent too much time sampling Kentucky's finest whiskey. "I know how it sounds," Pierce said quietly, "but I saw what I saw. And 6 people are missing from my town with no explanation. If there is even a chance this performer is the same man, we need to act." Webb leaned back in his chair, studying Pierce with sharp brown eyes. "The performer here calls himself Edmund Tyler. He arrived 2 days ago with a wagon and a tent, just like you described. But his face is not painted, and he is not performing as a clown. He says he is a mesmerist, that he can put people into trances and help them recall forgotten memories. Half the town is excited to see his show tomorrow night. The mayor's wife has already bought tickets." Pierce felt cold dread settle in his stomach. The name was different, the act was different, but the pattern was the same. A tent, invitation-only evening performances, people entering altered states of consciousness. "We need to see his tent," Pierce said, standing abruptly, "right now before he has a chance to perform." Webb hesitated, clearly torn between professional courtesy to a fellow lawman and not wanting to harass a legitimate businessman without cause. But something in Pierce's expression must have convinced him, because he grabbed his hat and gestured toward the door. "His tent is set up near the river, on the Clarkson property. But if this turns out to be nothing, If you are wrong about this man, you will owe me a hell of an apology." They rode together through Danville's quiet streets, past whitewashed churches and neat brick homes, toward the edge of town where the Kentucky River curved lazily through bottomland, thick with sycamores and cottonwoods. Pierce could see the tent from a quarter-mile away, a dark shape against the morning mist rising from the river. It was smaller than Ellery's tent had been, with plain canvas instead of stripes, but the placement was similar. Isolated, away from the main population, easy to approach without being seen. As they drew closer, Pierce noticed something that made his hand move instinctively toward his revolver. Carved into a tree near the tent was a symbol, a circular design with radiating lines that seemed to writhe and shift if you looked at them too long. He had seen that same symbol in the ashes of Ellery's tent, burned into the ground where the cabinet had stood. "Do you see that carving?" Pierce asked, pointing. Webb squinted at the tree. "Just looks like some old mark to me. Probably been there for years." But Pierce knew better. The wood around the carving was fresh, the sap still oozing from where the knife had cut. This mark was new, made within the last day or two. It was a signature, a claim of territory, a warning to those who knew how to read it. "Edmund Tyler is Thomas Ellery," Pierce said with certainty. "Same man, different name. We need to arrest him now, before he can perform tonight." They approached the tent carefully, weapons drawn. Webb called out, identifying himself as sheriff and demanding that Edmund Tyler emerge. There was no response. The tent flap hung open, moving slightly in the morning breeze. Pierce gestured for Webb to cover him, then approached the entrance. He could see inside, just barely, enough to know that the tent was empty. No furniture, no cabinet, no sign that anyone was setting up for a performance. Just bare ground and canvas walls. "He knew we were coming," Pierce said, holstering his weapon in frustration. "He must have left during the night." They searched the tent thoroughly, finding nothing except another of those strange symbols carved into the center pole. Webb's skepticism was beginning to crack, replaced by unease. "What the hell is going on here, Pierce? What are we dealing with?" Pierce did not answer immediately. He was staring at the symbol on the center pole, at the way it seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, at the faint whispering sound that seemed to emanate from the carved lines. He remembered Ellery's final words about the hunger finding another vessel, another form. The tent was empty, but Pierce could feel something present, something watching, waiting. "We are dealing with something that does not die when you shoot it," he finally said. "Something that moves from place to place, feeding, always feeding. And I think it is just getting started." Sheriff Webb organized a manhunt that covered 3 counties over the next week. Posses of armed men searched barns, abandoned buildings, and remote farms, looking for any trace of Edmund Tyler or Thomas Ellery, or whatever name the man was using now. They found nothing. It was as if he had vanished as completely as his victims. But Pierce knew the man was still out there, probably already setting up in another town under another name, preparing another tent, carving another symbol. Pierce returned to Harrodsburg, but the town he came back to was fundamentally changed. Families whose members had disappeared refused to speak with him, as if his failure to prevent the tragedies had made him somehow complicit. The festival square remained empty, merchants avoiding it as if the ground itself was cursed. Children no longer played in the streets after dark. A pall of fear had settled over Harrodsburg that no amount of time seemed able to lift. Martha Jenkins, the only person who had entered Ellery's tent and emerged alive, began experiencing strange symptoms. She would wake in the middle of the night, screaming about darkness that breathed, about voices calling her name from somewhere far away. Dr. Morrison prescribed laudanum to help her sleep, but the nightmares persisted. She told Pierce that she felt as if part of her was missing, as if something essential had been taken from her in that tent, something she could never recover. Pierce spent his evenings in his office compiling a detailed report of everything that had happened. He wrote down every observation, every theory, every scrap of information he had gathered about Thomas Ellery. He included sketches of the symbols he had seen, descriptions of the cabinet, accounts of the transformations he had witnessed. When he finished, the report was 40 pages long, a comprehensive document that he hoped might help others recognize and stop Ellery if he appeared again. He sent copies to the United States Marshal Service, to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, and to sheriffs across Kentucky and neighboring states. Most recipients probably dismissed it as the ravings of a traumatized lawman who had failed to solve a series of disappearances. But Pierce hoped that somewhere, someone would read it and understand, would see the pattern and take action before more people vanished. Winter settled over central Kentucky with unusual severity. Snow fell in November, earlier than anyone could remember, blanketing Harrodsburg in white silence. Pierce found himself walking the streets at night, unable to sleep, his mind replaying the events in that tent over and over. He kept seeing that impossibly tall figure rising from the flames, kept feeling the cold sensation of being marked. He knew with a certainty that bypassed rational thought that his encounter with Thomas Ellery was not finished. In December, Pierce received a letter. It was delivered by the regular post, addressed in elegant script with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing a message written in that same flowing handwriting. Dear Sheriff Pierce, I survived our encounter, as I have survived countless others before it. The hunger cannot be killed because the hunger is not alive in any sense you understand. It simply exists, as fundamental as gravity, as inevitable as death. You saw a fraction of its power that night. You witnessed a small feeding, a minor transaction. There are places in this world where the hunger has been active for centuries, where entire communities have been consumed, where the land itself has been transformed into something that exists partially in your world and partially in realms beyond. I am sorry that you stumbled into this knowledge. Ignorance, in this case, truly would have been bliss. But now that you know, now that you have been marked, you will never be free of it. You will see the signs everywhere once you learn to recognize them. You will understand that the disappearances you investigated in Harrodsburg are not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern that spans continents and centuries. Sleep well, Sheriff, if you still can. Perhaps we will meet again, though I suspect you would prefer otherwise. With sincere regards, your friend in the darkness. Pierce burned the letter immediately, but the words remained seared in his memory. He began researching historical records, looking for patterns of unexplained disappearances. What he found disturbed him profoundly. Every few decades, in communities across America and Europe, there were clusters of people who vanished without explanation. The details varied, but certain elements remained consistent. A traveling performer or stranger arriving in town, people attending private gatherings or shows, and then absence where there should have been presence. The research consumed Pierce. He filled notebooks with dates, locations, and names. He corresponded with other lawmen, historians, and librarians, gathering information about suspicious disappearances throughout history. The pattern he uncovered suggested something far more vast and ancient than a single murderer. It suggested an organized system, perhaps multiple individuals working in coordination, facilitating these disappearances for purposes Pierce could not begin to fathom. Martha Jenkins took her own life on a cold January morning, hanging herself from a rafter in her shop. She left a note that simply read, "It never stopped calling me. I'm so tired of hearing the voices, forgive me." Pierce attended her funeral, standing in the snow beside her grave, wondering if he could have done something to save her. But he knew the truth. Whatever had been done to Martha in that tent, whatever piece of her consciousness had been taken or transformed, the damage was permanent. She had been dying slowly ever since, and her suicide was simply the final stage of what Ellery had started. Spring came to Harrodsburg, but Sheriff Pierce barely noticed. He had aged years in the months since the fire, his hair going grey at the temples, deep lines etching his face. He no longer walked the streets with the confident stride of a man who understood his world. Instead, he moved carefully, watchfully, as if expecting something terrible to emerge from every shadow. His deputies whispered that he was losing his mind, that the stress of the unsolved disappearances had broken something fundamental inside him. Perhaps they were right. Pierce no longer trusted his own perceptions. He saw symbols carved into trees that others insisted were just natural marks. He heard whispers in the wind that spoke of hunger and transformation. He woke from nightmares where he was back in that tent, watching the darkness flow from the cabinet, unable to move or scream or save anyone. He knew he was damaged, possibly beyond repair, but he could not stop. The hunger was still out there, still feeding, and he was one of the few people who knew it existed. In April, Pierce resigned as sheriff. He told the town council that his health was declining, that he needed to retire and rest. They accepted his resignation with poorly concealed relief, eager to replace him with someone who had not been tainted by the festival tragedy. Pierce turned in his badge, packed his belongings, and left Harrodsburg without ceremony or farewell. He had no destination in mind, only a vague intention to follow the trail of disappearances, to document the pattern, to perhaps find some way to warn others or stop what could not be stopped. He traveled for months, moving from town to town, always arriving too late. In Tennessee, he found a burned barn where a traveling magician had performed 3 weeks earlier. 7 people missing, no bodies found. In Virginia, he discovered an abandoned farmhouse where a mysterious woman had held seances. 12 people gone and symbols carved into every doorframe. In Ohio, he heard stories about a puppet show that had entranced an entire school, leaving 15 children in catatonic states from which they never recovered. Each location added to Pierce's understanding and deepened his despair. The pattern was global, systematic and ancient. The hunger had been feeding on humanity for longer than recorded history, taking people in small batches, never enough to attract widespread attention, but consistently, relentlessly. And there were custodians, people like Thomas Ellery, who facilitated the feeding. Some did it knowingly, perhaps receiving some benefit Pierce could not identify. Others might be unwitting participants, possessed or controlled by something they did not understand. In November 1879, exactly 1 year after the Harrodsburg Festival, Pierce found himself in a small town in Pennsylvania. He was staying in a boarding house, exhausted from months of travel and investigation, when he saw the poster. It was nailed to a tree in the town square, advertising a special performance by a traveling mesmerist named Edmund Tyler. The show would take place in a tent on the outskirts of town. Adults only. Invitation required. Pierce felt something break inside him, or perhaps click into place. He had been running, investigating, documenting, but always arriving too late to prevent anything. Here was his chance to be present, to intervene, to perhaps save the people who would otherwise disappear. He knew it was probably futile. He knew that one man with a gun could not stop something that had existed for centuries. But he had to try. Martha Jenkins had died, calling out to voices only she could hear. The 6 people transformed in Ellery's tent had ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Pierce owed it to them, and to all the other victims, to make one more attempt. He attended Edmund Tyler's performance that night, carrying his revolver and a can of kerosene. The tent was smaller than Ellery's had been, but the setup was identical. The carved symbols, the oil lamps, the wooden cabinet in the center. And Edmund Tyler himself, who turned to look at Pierce as he entered, whose face was different, but whose eyes were exactly the same dark pools that absorbed rather than reflected light. "Sheriff Pierce," Tyler said, his voice carrying that same smooth, hypnotic quality that Ellery's had possessed. "I have been expecting you. The hunger has been expecting you. You were marked, after all. Did you think you could escape? Did you think your investigation would lead to anything other than this moment?" Pierce raised his revolver, aiming at Tyler's chest. Around him, a dozen townspeople sat on benches, already entranced, already beginning their transformation. The darkness was flowing from the cabinet, reaching for them with tendrils that pulsed with obscene life. Pierce knew he could not save them. He could barely save himself. But he could bear witness. He could document this final encounter. And perhaps somehow, his testimony would reach someone who could finally end the hunger's reign. "This is your last chance," Pierce said, his voice steady, despite the fear coursing through him. "Step away from the cabinet. Let these people go. End this now, or I will end you." Tyler smiled. And in that smile, Pierce saw not just one man but countless others, an infinite regression of custodians stretching back through time. "You cannot end what has no beginning," Tyler said softly. "Welcome home, Sheriff Pierce. The hunger has been waiting for you, and oh, how it has missed you." The darkness reached for Pierce, cold and eager and patient, and somewhere in the distance, Clayton Pierce heard himself scream. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, We open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.